network of socialist activists who are trying to give an alternative to the capitalist system through education and through actual grassroots organizing and activism. We meet every Monday at 7 p.m. in Arjona 137. We weren't having a meeting tonight because we're having this event. So this talk is going to be called Was the Soviet Union a Socialist Society? This is a question that has to come up basically to all socialist activists. It has to be answered by them to sort of portray what a genuine socialist society would look like. So I'm going to try to go through some of the historical underpinnings for why Stalinism won over in the former Soviet Union, and just sort of give a general sweep of the historical events and then an analysis of it from the socialist perspective. So before I describe the general sweep of events that make up the Russian Revolution, I first want to provide the context which it occurred in. In February 1917, Russia was involved in World War I, and there was a deep economic crisis. Millions of soldiers had died at the front, not only from combat, but from starvation and disease. Inside Russia, there was mass unemployment and widespread food shortages. The war had drained the economy of the resources for the country, both in materials and labor power. This is the context that the February Revolution took place in. The upsurge began on International Women's Day in 1917, when tens of thousands of female textile workers went on strike, demonstrating against the war and food shortages. This strike was not called by any organization, but was a spontaneous action on the part of women workers in Petrograd, which was the capital of Russia. Their demonstrations were attacked by the police, and over the next few days, the strike spread to other cities and the demonstrations became larger and more militant. Workers began demanding the overthrow of the autocracy and the end to Russia's involvement in the war. In the face of increasing police repression, workers took it upon themselves to disarm the police force and drive them into hiding. The Tsar tried to send in troops to crush the movement of workers and peasants, but these soldiers joined over to the revolution instead. With no one left to defend the regime, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne and handed power to his brother, who immediately passed it into the hands of a new provisional government formed out of the landed aristocracy and the capitalist class. During the upsurge, workers and soldiers created Soviets, or councils, to represent their interests and help them coordinate the struggle. These Soviets were the mass organizations of the working class and poor peasantry. In the Soviets, workers elected people from amongst their own class to represent them. The representatives were subject to immediate recall if they did not represent the will of their constituency. This form of organization was far more democratic and representative than any parliamentary form of government seen in capitalist countries before or since. The Soviets were organs of workers' democracy that would become central to the struggle for socialist revolution in Russia over the course of the next few years. Immediately after toppling the Tsar, there was a dual power situation in the country. On the one hand, there was the provisional government made up of members of the property classes and the bourgeoisie or capitalist class. This government was unelected and was given formal power from the Tsar's brother upon his abdication. On the other hand, there were the Soviets, which were the institutions of the working class. Elections to the first Petrograd Soviet produced a majority for the Socialist Revolutionary Party, or the SRs, and the Menshevik Party. The Executive Committee of the Soviet then ratified the authority of the provisional government and gave it its support. Both the SRs and the Mensheviks were trying to hand power to the capitalist class and limit the gains of the revolution within the confines of what the capitalists were comfortable with. And both of these parties also favored continued involvement in World War I. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, proposed something much different from the strategies of the SRs and the Mensheviks. Instead of forming a coalition government with the capitalists, in which the interests of the working class and the poor peasantry would be subordinated, the Bolsheviks argued that all power should be transferred into the hands of the working class. They also argued for an immediate end to Russia's involvement in the war and called for immediate land reform. Lenin, arriving back in Petrograd in April, published his April thesis which outlined the tasks of the working class and the Bolshevik Party in the revolution. and this is a quote from the April thesis. The specific feature of the present situation in Russia is that the country is passing from the first stage of the revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasantry. For the time being, the formal power lied in the hands of the capitalist class and the landed aristocracy. But this was only possible with the tacit support from the Soviets. There would eventually come a time when either the provisional government would be overthrown or the Soviets would be crushed. This dual power situation couldn't drag out forever. So soon after Lenin published his April thesis, another document was released which caused an outrage throughout the country. In mid-April, with the release of the Milyakov Note, it was discovered that the provisional government had made backroom deals with the Allied powers to continue Russia's involvement in World War I and carry the war through to the end. Knowledge of this sparked huge demonstrations of workers throughout the country on April 20th and 21st. The workers were calling for the sacking of Milyakov and an end to the war. Milyakov was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the provisional government. General Kornilov, who was the general of the Russian army, demanded that the provisional government, which was under the leadership of SR member Alexander Kerensky, to allow him to use military force against the workers. Not wanting to provoke a larger upsurge, the government restrained and instead pressured Milyakov to step down as Minister of Foreign Affairs on May 2nd. The demand to end the war went unanswered, however. Far from ending the war, Kerensky underwent to organize a military offensive on the Eastern Front in June and July. The results were disastrous, with the offensive being beaten back and the army retreating in disarray. Despite the obvious mass anti-war sentiment and the breakdown of the Russian military, Kerensky pursued this disastrous policy for the sake of the capitalist class and the war profiteers. The SRs and the Mensheviks also went along with this and supported Kerensky in pursuing his war policies. As the first Congress of Soviets was about to be held, and the provisional government pursued war to the death, the Bolsheviks went about to call for armed demonstrations of workers in the capital on June 23rd. The goal of this was to pressure the delegates of the Congress to break with the provisional government and take all power into the hands of the Soviets. This slogan, "All power to the Soviets," which was coined by Lenin, would become the rallying cry for militant workers throughout the country in the coming months to create a working-class socialist government. The SRs and Mensheviks, upon hearing about the June 23rd demonstration, campaigned vigorously against it. And under this pressure, the Bolsheviks backed down and settled for an unarmed demonstration organized by the Petrograd Soviet set for July 1st.